Okay, great, perfect, thank you. And ready? 3, 2, and welcome to Remote Access. We will begin in just a moment. Welcome to Remote Access. We'll begin in just a moment. Welcome to Remote Access. We'll begin in just one moment. Welcome to Remote Access. We'll begin in just a moment. Welcome to Remote Access. I'm delighted to turn the floor over to Access Global Board President, Nathaniel Goldman. Nathaniel, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, and welcome to Remote Access's Shared Pride, a conversation about Jewish advocacy in the LGBTQ community. I'm Nathaniel Goldman, President of Access Global. For those who are joining for the first time, Access is the Young Professionals Division of the American Jewish Committee, whose mission is to combat anti-Semitism, promote Israel's place in the world, and promote democratic values. I'm delighted to introduce our experts for this session. Arya Marvazy is a first-generation American born to Iranian immigrants. Following a 7-year student leader to professional career at Hillel of San Diego and Hillel International offices in Washington, D.C., Arya has fully embraced his alignment as a nonprofit Jewish communal lifer. In 2015, Arya began in a body of work he had dreamt of since he was a teenager, advocating for the full equality of the LGBTQ+ individuals in the Persian, Jewish, and broader communities. In less than 2 years, Arya has advanced from consultant to managing director of JQ International, an LGBTQ+ Jewish nonprofit that seeks to transform Jewish communities by ensuring inclusion through education, support, and identity enrichment. Rachael Fried, the executive director of JQY, is committed to ensuring that the voices of female identifying and LGBTQ individuals in the Orthodox Jewish community are heard and celebrated. During her time at JQY, she has devoted herself to creating the more inclusive spaces for individuals of all gender identities. Rachael received her BA in studio art from Yeshiva University, where she served as Stern student body president and helped orchestrate the participation of Stern students in the groundbreaking 2009 Yeshiva University panel, Being Gay in Modern Orthodox World. The event, which was organized by JQY, is cited with having inspired a 2010 statement of principles calling on acceptance of gay people in the Orthodox communities and signed by over 200 Orthodox rabbis. Without further ado, I hand it over to Dana Steiner, Director of AJC Access Global, to moderate our conversation. Dana, take it away.
Thank you, Nathaniel, and thank you, Arya and Rachael, for joining us today for this very important discussion. We're so happy to have you both. I just want to remind everyone before we begin our conversation that you can submit questions for our experts by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Let's get into it. So both of you have been working professionally in the Jewish LGBTQ+ space for some time, but it's interesting to note that you originally started in other fields. How did you find yourself here working specifically in Jewish LGBTQ spaces, and what did that journey look like for you? Arya, let's start with you.
Sure. So it is an interesting story. So many of us Jewish nonprofit professionals have this sort of roundabout journey to where we are now. I studied psychology in undergrad, and I got a master's degree in organizational behavior when I recognized that clinical psychology would be difficult for me because I'm a very empathetic and sensitive soul, and disconnecting from the work would become too difficult. So I took my path down the route of essentially organizational behavior management and development, and that meant focusing on human behavior but in the workplace. And it just so happened that after a couple of years of deeper involvement with my Hillel chapter at UC San Diego, that I was offered a position at San Diego State Hillel, like an entry-level 3-year-old engagement associate thing. But then I found this incredibly rich community and opportunity at Hillel that I felt like, you know, this is, at least in the sphere of alignment, one of the most empowered career paths I might take on. And it just so happened that escalating into the work with Hillel International, again, this really powerful opportunity to do professional development and human resource management and training and education in the Hillel space meant that I got to be my sort of most authentic Jewish self, and also like uplift the Jewish community, in that case, on college campuses. And interestingly enough, I also began behind the scenes and from within the closet some LGBT organizing at Hillel International, where I just sort of reignited an LGBTQ and allied professionals group for Hillel Pros. But I put under my signature sort of addendum, I am not out of the closet. Please do not share about me, the organizer, in any which way, shape, or form. And what happened was that really a dream came true, as Nathaniel mentioned, that as I came out of the closet and was able to establish that in a positive way with my family, that I identified LGBT activism as my real goal for my career path. And that came, interestingly, to Persian Jewish parents. But JQ here in LA has been around since 2004. I knew about them. I even attended an event. And after I came out very publicly on a Facebook video, I found this really unique fit to do some work with them. And that's where the consulting began on their team, JQSA, the Jewish Queer Straight Alliance. And in a really rich, beautiful, aligned way has brought me to this moment.
That's so beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing. Rachael.
Yes, thank you. So I actually started in JQI as a participant when JQI was focusing more on the young adult realm rather than working with kids and teens. And I grew up in an Orthodox community as a very closeted person. And so I went to a JQI event. Actually, I went because one of my friends was like, I need a wing person. Will you come with me to this event? And I was like, well, I don't need support, but I'll go with you if you need me to come with you. And it turns out that I really did need the support. And I also noticed that every JQI, I started going regularly, and every JQI meeting that I went to would have it would be like a room of 40 like cisgendered men, and then me, and then maybe like one other revolving seat of a person who would come and muster up the strength to come to something that was both queer and for people who are from Orthodox communities, and then realize that they get there and still feel like they don't fit in. And so I started as a volunteering, building the JQI women's program, which was meant to be like a smaller sub-community so that everybody could start going to the broader JQI events. And as I got more and more involved, I saw that this was an organization that really could benefit from my strengths that I had. And as Nathaniel mentioned, I have a strange background of a combination of studio art, and I also went to social work school, and I also have a master's in systems design for social change. And so all of those things sort of combined together and allowed me to build JQI into what it is today. And I mean, I think that's one of the challenging but really fun things about working in a really small organization, is that I get to wear so many hats that I'm the head of marketing, and I'm the head of communications and fundraising and all these other things. And so there was this opportunity for me to be using my creative side in this work. And now the way that I look at it is that I strive to build the resources that I didn't get to have growing up, but so badly needed.
Thank you so much for sharing. It's really nice to be able to see it's not a virtual background, it's your real background, and you have your art that's displayed behind you, which is pretty incredible for those who haven't yet seen Rachael's art. It's really wonderful. You mentioned something which I think is actually a perfect segue into our next question, which is about looking back at the resources that existed X number of years ago. Things have really changed dramatically. And you know, we were talking about this yesterday in preparation for our discussion, and both of you noted how some of the advocacy that you're doing now would have been inconceivable 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. How would you say that the Jewish LGBTQ advocacy landscape has evolved over the last several years? Rachael, if you want to start us off.
Wonderful. Yeah, so I mean, so much, like so drastically, in a way that I think I never could have imagined. First of all, I think people are coming out much younger now than they were before. And it used to be that when someone who is 17 would come to a JQY meeting, that would be like a really young person. And now we get calls from people who are 13 and under, and whose parents are calling us, and we have to tell them, actually, we're working on building children's programming, and we don't have that yet, because that's just a new need that's occurring right now. So that's one thing. And I think that also the mindset and the asks are very different. It used to be that people would like, when I was younger, it would be like, okay, I'll be like subtle here, and just please don't kick me out of my school or of my community. And just it was a very low bar, I think, that was and the expectation was just really low. And now the conversation is so beyond that. Now the conversation is, I want to be my full self. I don't want to be quiet about it. And I don't want you to just not kick me out. I want you to acknowledge that and even celebrate me. That's like a huge difference, just the expectation that people have. And the ask is just so much bigger, and there's so much more dignity involved in the conversation now than there was before. And I think, lastly, I think that for me at least personally, the support that I received was more of like a healing kind of support, where it was like, you experienced a lot of trauma growing up, and now there's support in that you're not the only one who went through that, and there are people who can understand your experiences. And I think now the way that we look at our work is that rather than it being healing, it's preventative. So we work with kids before they get to the stage where they have to be in this, like, going through all of these traumas and just difficulties that other people had to go through before them. And now hopefully they get to have the support to be able to go through those things with strength and being empowered in a way that just wasn't that wasn't happening before.
Thank you, Rachael. Arya.
The beauty of presenting with Rachael is that we are in a very similar ecosystem. So I guess I'll build on everything you mentioned, which I so fully agree with, Rachael. Actually, from the perspective of Jewish queer nonprofit professionals, it's interesting to reflect on the larger nonprofit Jewish community. When we think about 15 years ago, when JQ was getting started in 2004, and Asher, our executive director, felt that sort of split at the root sense that he couldn't be queer in Jewish spaces and bringing his Judaism to queer spaces. None of that really gelled, in a way that he could be his full self anywhere. And when he turned to the existing Jewish landscape to say, I want to start something, I want to do something, I want to move this community forward in the spheres of support and, just being able to live fully, the response was more or less like, keep it hush, not now, no thank you, this is not our focus, this is not our priority in the Jewish communal space. It was anything but, oh my God, yes, of course, this is exactly what the community needs now. For us to think about Jewish identity, Jewish community, and Jewish continuity, the uplifting of our queer, friends, family, and community members is like inherently important, but that wasn't what we were hearing. Whereas if we're speaking in 2020, I think probably Rachael would say the same thing. And first of all, there's over 15 LGBTQ Jewish organizations globally. And that says something about where the movement is at. And I would honestly say that many of us have really different niche talents and skill sets that we're bringing to the larger conversation. The way that people might have thought about LGBTQ inclusion in the past was, we might have a conversation about it and feel really good about now our synagogue or our institution having done the inclusion work. And as we know good and well, an hour and a half, even 3, will barely scratch the surface of what it means to make structural change in the Jewish world. So in the sphere of the landscape, I think now institutions understand they're engaging with us as queer activists to do long-term consultation and think about how are we changing the entire system at a synagogue, a day school, a Jewish camp, and elsewhere to really think about what it means to be inclusive. And I think what Rachael mentioned is really beautiful about us fighting the battle on behalf of those, the things that we suffered and the insecurities that we had and the lack of role modeling that we saw is now, I'm not gonna say it's done. I'm sure there is that unique identity that still doesn't feel resembled in the Jewish landscape, but I wanna say in a much larger way, a Jewish queer soul today could Google Jewish queer or Jewish LGBTQ and find page upon page of resources, unlike Rachael and I at 12, 15, and 18, looking at the same world and feeling very differently.
Yeah, and I'll also just add really quickly to that, when you used to Google Jewish and queer, it used to be, there was a conversion therapy organization that was like the first thing that came up, and now there are all these resources that come up instead, which is a huge, huge difference.
Which is amazing. And I think it's also really interesting, before we go to our next question, I'm even thinking of how the two of you are using the word queer, which is like a reclaimed word, which was not something that was used in a positive way. It was used in a pejorative way to other members of the LGBTQ community. And now it's almost like a catch-all in many ways for young people to identify themselves, and it is in many ways. And I think it's just even that within the last 5-10 years is an important understanding of the use of language. Using one's preferred gender pronouns, which is an important thing, which really wasn't when I was in college 10 plus years ago. That wasn't part of one's orientation. So I think it's, or at least like when I say orientation, I mean like college orientation. Now it's sort of standard practice. So I think reflecting on that is a super exciting and an important piece. I want to discuss a little bit, because one of the things that you've both been speaking about is your sense of authentic identity and your full self and your full identities. So while LGBTQ Jewish communities have created amazing and phenomenal spaces like JQY and JQ International, specifically for LGBTQ plus Jews, we've been in touch with and have heard from many advocates that they're concerned about antisemitism and anti-Israel rhetoric in non-Jewish LGBTQ communities. After recent incidents over the past years at the Chicago and D.C. Dyke Marches, many LGBTQ Jews are advocating for spaces that embrace both their Jewish and queer identities. What has this reality looked like for you as professionals working in this space? Either of you can start if a thought comes to you.
All right. Okay. Well, I'll just say, I think this is something that I've definitely experienced on both ends, where there's, I've experienced homophobia and like queer phobia in Jewish spaces and anti-Semitism in queer spaces. And that is that applies to even to funders, I think, when that's something that we've encountered in all kinds of spaces. And I think that, I know that that's a really lonely feeling, going into a space and feeling like one of my identities is not welcome here, but the other one is completely celebrated as long as they leave the other part at the door. And it's something that is really unfortunate and really, really difficult, and is the reason why I think so many Jewish queer organizations do exist now, to be able to create those spaces. And our like main core Jewish value at JQY is that of Elu v'Elu, which means both these and those, and meaning that there can be multiple seemingly conflicting truths that are all true at the same time. And that's something that we really work hard to model and to build at JQY, especially because we are a support organization, and our main thing is that support is not contingent upon belief. and that wherever you come from and whatever you believe in and wherever you stand in terms of politics, or I think specifically Israel is a really big part of this conversation, that you belong here. And your whole self belongs here no matter what. And so we, during the past presidential election, we had people who were super Hillary supporters, and we had people who came to the drop-in center who were wearing Make America Great Again hats. And we work really hard to be able to have a space where those people can exist at the same time and have respectful dialogue, and also just be people together in the same space, even if they're not talking about that. And similarly, we march in the Celebrate Israel parade every year in New York when there is not a pandemic. And we march in the parade, and we also make sure that we advertise ways that people can protest that parade safely, if that's the way that they, if that's where they would like to be. And so it's a really difficult thing to navigate, and something that we have to always be thinking about really proactively all the time. And that's where we are right now. And I think it's really, that's why I think it's so important that places like JQY and JQ International exist.
Totally. Thanks, Rachel. Arya.
I appreciate so much of that, Rachel. I think to myself about how even our own organization's branding and marketing has shifted over the years to communicate that, yes, this is an organization, it's a Jewish organization informed by Jewish values, but our audience, our potential constituent base is everyone. It is not like a Jewish organization for Jewish people exclusively. It is a Jewish organization for all. And we actually shifted in particular for our helpline, which is getting calls from around the world, calls and emails from around the world. We wanted to name on the front lines that the tagline for the helpline is, whoever you are, whatever you need, we are here for you. And that's to communicate that it is both LGBTQ and ally, it is both Jewish and otherwise, it is of all genders, orientations, races, ethnicities. And that is important to this larger conversation about how we fit into a queer advocacy landscape. Because I do think what's so meaningful to us, which is to have these united identities celebrated and shared in events and education and all the rest, might make another person feel like, well, that's just for you and not for me. And in particular, as it relates to combating anti-Semitism, I'm now speaking with like my JQ hat off, but as Arya, as an individual, I've really been thinking hard about how it is that we as Jewish educators and community organizers and leaders are working to inform the world, the globe, about who Jews are and what we value and what our ethics are and what drives the communities that we serve. And because of this sort of opening up of, and in particular, a sort of direct communication to the audience that everyone's interfaith partners or interfaith families or friends and others are welcome to our Shabbat dinners, are welcome to our Pride celebrations and Rosh Hashanah and Passover and all the rest. It's been really beautiful to see an uptick in individuals who don't identify as Jewish showing up to the JQ space, and we see that as a point of pride. In my own experience, unfortunately, I too, in particular, just at an LA queer establishment, having a conversation with a complete stranger that was going really well. And then I mentioned my last visit to Israel, and the question became, wait, are you a Zionist? And I said, yes. Like, is that going to change the tone of our conversation? And basically he just walked away from me, like not having, like, we're done, it's over. And I think there's immense work to be done as it relates to helping individuals understand a Jewish person's connection or lack of connection to Israel does not have to inform their acceptance or non-acceptance into a queer space. It is not monolithic in any which way, shape, or form. And I think from a bigoted perspective, one might find that a proud Zionist queer Jew, may be less welcome into queer spaces today. And even as it related to the conversation around certain parts of BLM or the movement for Black Lives supporting BDS, I can just tell you what a resolution was for my friends and I was that we would show up for movements for justice as we are and let our intersection of identities speak for themselves. So I'm going to support Black Lives with my full heart and soul, even if they're members of that group that are anti-Israel or support BDS or are anti-Zionist, because the exchange between them and myself may potentially fodder evolution on this subject for both of us. And that's what I think the larger community can consider doing, rather than the cancel culture of if, then, where there is an opportunity to just come to the table and try and build, I guess, as compassionately as possible at all times.
Thank you so much for these perspectives. And I think it really lends itself really nicely to our next question, which is that, you know, anti-Semitism is not new. However, one could make the case that, at least here in the United States, I know we have participants who are calling in from around the world, and that reality may be different, especially for our colleagues and counterparts in Europe and in other places. But a resurgence in domestic anti-Semitism is certainly something that has been on the radar of the AJC and for many of our interlocutors around the country. So I guess my question here is, would you say that anti-Semitism has been more prevalent in non-Jewish LGBTQ spaces in recent years? Is it more of a rising phenomena? And to your point, Arya, you talked about engaging in conversation, showing up where it matters, because there may be an evolution in the kinds of conversations and engaging in methods of understanding. Have you had conversations with those in non-Jewish LGBTQ spaces about how to address or how to curb rising anti-Semitism or things like that, whether it's, you know, pertain to anti-Semitism specifically, or whether it's pertain to anti-Zionism, anti-Israelism, etc.? So maybe Arya, we'll start with you.
Sure. Well, it's interesting because before we, either as an organization or as individuals, are able to uplift our priority of combating anti-Semitism and feeling safe in our own country, in the arena of cultivating allyship, I posit that actually having a value proposition for the individual you're engaging comes first. So as an organization, you know, I mean, for a long time now, but really in an even more rich way over the course of the past 5 years, interfaith community organizing has been a direct output of our organization each year. And it's interesting because where we have educational panels that are speaking about trans identity, teen queer identity, parents and allies, the Persian community, and otherwise, it is never a panel of fully Jews. It is always a collection of individuals from different backgrounds, so as to create a more holistically inclusive environment, even as a Jewish queer LGBTQ, LGBT organization. When I think to like our annual Iftar Shabbat with the Muslim community, and the fact that the Persian Pride Fellowship is open to individuals of other backgrounds, in those spaces, in a really rich, organic way, conversations about hate and about bigotry, and in particular, just the sort of rise in those incidences of hate over the course of the last 4 years come up that affect all of us. And I think that's, in one way, that sort of coalition building where we're connecting and building with one another in ways that would be meaningful to both, and then the conversations that become either individually meaningful, and in most cases, Islamophobia and anti-Semitism are sort of siblings in another way. There is this like rich opportunity to I guess approach that work and to have conversations about it. I've had an interesting thought that I just feel is worthy to mention here, and again is not JQ specific, but as I thought about the different phobias in the world, homophobia and transphobia, and just hatred that is rooted in different phobias, when I think about the queer community, the likelihood that an individual might come across a LGBTQ friend, family, or community member on a global scale is so infinitely more likely than an individual coming across one of the 17 million Jews out of the 8 billion people on planet Earth. And the fact that we are in a scenario where the vast majority of humans on planet Earth have never met a Jew, do not know what a Jew is, what we represent, and that of the 3 monotheistic faiths, 2 of them in certain sects have really, really deeply anti-Jewish ideology. And I just think coming from that perspective when you talk to someone about anti-Semitism and really starting at the bare bones of who we are and what we stand for is so much more, potentially more productive than you can't be so hateful. I'm gonna fight your hate because that's just not okay for the world. It's more like, what do you understand about us? Where did that information come from? Do you have relationships with Jewish people? In much the same way I would organize for queer advocacy and queer life. Like, what do you believe about us? Where did those thoughts and beliefs come from? Have you ever met one of us? Do you know our stories? And so this all sort of speaks to how we might begin to think about fighting anti-Semitism more broadly, especially with the experience of being queer and recognizing, for those who don't know us and have had no positive examples of who we are, then ideas of hate or bigotry can very comfortably seep in.
Thank you so much for sharing that idea, and I think it's so resonant. Rachel.
Yeah, I'll echo a lot of what Arya said. I think the parallel processes I think that happen between coming out as Jewish in a queer space and coming out as queer in a Jewish space are like wild. I think there are so many things that just so many comparisons that can be made, and it's like Arya said, sort of humanizing any person and any identity just is the first step for removing any of that hate. And I mean, I think to go back to your original question, it feels like there's more anti-Semitism now than there has been before. And also, I'm not sure if that's because there's more social media now and more ways to connect and mobilize globally and just to communicate that. Because definitely with the rise in global communication and organizing, it feels like there is more anti-Semitism. But it's it's interesting. Like the support that we provide is also intersectional, and as it should be. So like we also, our mission at JQY is that we support LGBTQ youth with a focus on those from Orthodox, Hasidic, and Sephardi Mizrahi homes. And also everybody is welcome at JQY, as long as you're within the age limits that we have, which at our drop-in center is 13 to 23. We're not making sure that you're definitely queer or that you're definitely Jewish, or if you feel you belong in this space, then you belong. And we have a lot of people actually who are like pretty regular, consistent participants who are not Jewish, who just feel like they really belong in the support space for whatever reason that is to them. And I think that that's because there are a lot of parallels between the struggles of people with intersecting identities, no matter where they're from. And that's also something to note.
That's really helpful, Rachel. And I see we're getting a couple questions in the Q&A, which we'll address momentarily, but one of the questions actually addresses intersectionality. So we'll get to that. Fear not, there will be a question on intersectionality that comes up a little bit later. So I want to remind folks that if you do have questions for our experts, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. My next question is about what we can do internally. So, the Jewish community, as we've discussed, has really come a long way, but there are also still significant opportunities to combat homophobia and transphobia within the Jewish community. What are some of the concrete action steps that we can take to do this work as advocates? As you know, AJC is a global Jewish advocacy organization. We've actually been doing a lot of work in the LGBTQ space, building relationships and working on various partnerships that can help to bolster this work. And I'll give a shout out to my colleagues at AJC Chicago who have done amazing work in this regard, my colleagues in AJC Atlanta who were instrumental in helping to pass a hate crimes bill, which included protections for LGBTQ members in the Georgia community. That was really immense. But with these concrete legislative pieces, which protect the safety and well-being of LGBTQ folks, Jewish or not, where are areas that we can focus internally within the Jewish community to ensure that we're combating transphobia and homophobia wherever it exists? So Rachel, I'll start with you.
Great. So I think that there is amazing power in being a visible and vocal, proactive ally. I think that not only is that important for people who are part of the LGBTQ community to see, but also for other people who maybe feel like they're sort of like closeted allies, we call them at JQI, where they're like not so vocal about it because maybe that would be a little uncomfortable for them. But the more vocal allies there are, the more visible allies there are, the less taboo this conversation becomes. And I think there are a number of ways to do that. I think if we were in person, I would say like even the idea of having like a tiny little rainbow sticker somewhere in your office, the way that I think about that, talking about like comparing it to Jewish experiences, to me that feels like if I were to see a store in the middle of like Alabama that had a mezuzah on the door, where I would feel like I would see it and I'd be like, oh, I totally didn't expect this place to be a place that like it's a symbol of sort of safety, even though I didn't know officially that it was unsafe for me, but now I officially know that this is a place where I'm welcome and that this part of my identity is welcome. I think that's how I feel when I see a little rainbow flag somewhere. And there are ways to do that even on Zoom. I try to have like a little, I think you can maybe see it over there, a little rainbow flag in my background somewhere when I'm on Zoom. I also think adding pronouns to one's Zoom name is a way to just show that I get this and I'm like supportive of learning your pronouns and asking your pronouns, and I'm a safe person. This is like I'm modeling this, and I'm a safe person who is educated and knowledgeable in basically queer competency. I think also like financially supporting queer initiatives, even and that I was taught that the highest level of giving is if you give anonymously, but I think that in this case, if you give even like $2 publicly to a queer organization, I think that speaks, like it just is so loud, and I would encourage everybody to just like $1 to all these different places, like out loud. And I think also like educating yourself and making sure that you are listening to the voices of people who have these experiences is so important. And so panels like this, and there are so many other kinds of resources and places where you can hear and listen to people. I think that it's so important. And then lastly, just being aware of the language that one uses when speaking. So are really more aware of the assumptions that one makes. So like I grew up in a synagogue where it was just like assumed that I would one day hope to marry a man and have a husband and a nice, Jewish family in that way. And that assumption was so painful to me growing up. And if like 2 words had been changed in those sentences, where it was just like everyone here, or I mean, I don't know if everyone here, but the assumption that like I would maybe one day have a spouse and not a husband would have been so welcome and lovely to me, rather than everyone assuming that this is how I am and this is how I identify and this is my and this is the way that I plan to live my life. And so just being aware of your assumptions and talking accordingly, and also like not being afraid to talk about things. Even though there are a lot of potential mistakes that one can make, I think that coming into these conversations with an open mind and making it clear that you're wanting to learn and that you make a mistake and you're willing to apologize and learn and move forward, I think is also really important.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Such important lessons. And I certainly know that I'm internalizing a lot of these things, even in my own thinking about how we communicate. So really, thank you for sharing that. Arya.
Yeah, I mean, ditto to all these core pieces. One of the things I hope people take away from this call, if you're listening, is that we're really aiming to mark the difference between a supporter of the LGBTQ community and an ally of the LGBTQ community. And I want to start by saying that both really matter and both are immensely valuable. And that minimal difference is that a supporter believes in the full equality of LGBTQ individuals, may even say that to their LGBTQ friends, family, and community members, and knows it in their heart, and they support queer lives and queer equality. That one minuscule step of a difference between that supporter becoming an ally is that there is measurable action done to support and secure and affirm the equality and inclusion of LGBTQ people. So that can be as simple as a post on Facebook about a beautiful article that someone saw about a queer couple getting their adoptive child that they worked so hard to get. I mean, to the rest of the world, what that single post might communicate on Facebook is, if I was LGBTQ, you would accept me as well. And you're celebrating queer lives. Of course, signing petitions, raising your voice when transgender people are being banned from the military and serving the American country, you know, being in a pride parade, all these other sort of that many more outward steps are also incredibly valuable, but I want people to understand the value of the subtlety as well. Rachael, I hadn't heard that before about, you know, how powerful a public contribution is, and I love it. I think that's so beautiful. It's true that every time we do a Facebook fundraiser or anything else where people are able to share also that they care and that they're giving, that happens in a way that is seen by others, because you're making a direct communication to the other queer people that are in your life. I care about you. The thing I'd say, I guess, to expand upon, because this is JQ's wheelhouse, is that we work with institutions and organizations, Jewish or otherwise, around the world, to help them do an audit on their own space and to understand how inclusive they are being and how they can move on our inclusion spectrum that moves from hostility to full embrace. And what's interesting, which goes back to that first question about how has the conversation evolved, is that 10, 15, definitely 20 years ago, when someone was speaking about LGBTQ inclusion, the key term was tolerance. It was like, you're queer, but I can tolerate it. Like, I tolerate it's almost like tolerating something is like, it could be a nuisance that you get used to, or, you know, something that is odd for you, but that you adjust to. We're so many leagues beyond that today. We're moving from hostility to tolerance, to acceptance, to inclusion, to full embrace. And there is so much powerful work that can be done by individuals and systems. And I want to make the call out to anyone who's listening. Reach out to us, JQI or JQ International, to have this conversation. We have a helpline. It's 855-JQI-HELPS, HLPS. And our whole bread and butter is helping people to do this work. And I want people to understand that Rachael and I have grown in our understanding of queer life since we became activists. We are, I love that you're using the term expert, Dana, but we are also in this revolutionary time where we're understanding new identities every day. So it's not as though we've done the work and or we're queer, so we already embody all the information necessary. Like, we're in the learning with you as our allies. So recognize that, you know, there is always more to grow as this conversation is immensely evolving, you know, in the past 10 years, and I would imagine for the next 10 to 20 and far beyond. So tap us for those conversations. And, you know, it could be 3 friends that decide, you know, I've never actually been trained on LGBTQ identity. I don't know the differences between, like, in the LGBTQ acronym, like L, G, and B are sexual or romantic orientations, but T is a gender identity and gender expression conversation. How is that different, right? Like, we don't assume anyone should have the information, but we would love if people step in with us to learn that information and to become more inclusive by virtue of that.
That's so great. And I love these concrete pieces of action, because they're things that we can all do in our lives as advocates. They're things we can do in the relationships that we hold in our communities. These are just such essential pieces. And, you know, the one thing I'll just share on behalf of Access is that we're really excited to pass diversity, equity, and inclusion clauses in our bylaws, which basically essentially says that we want to ensure that our leadership is as reflective of the diversity of the Jewish community. And as such, we really take seriously the need to ensure that all advocates in our space can be their full authentic selves in all of their identities, which is one of the reasons why we're working to ensure that folks in the LGBTQ community can be the advocates they want to be in all of those different spaces. So in our remaining time, please.
Quickly, just the fact that, I meant to say this before speaking, but everything that Rachael and I just said about the inclusion of queer people could be picked up and juxtaposed onto the conversation about racial justice, about Jews of color, about Jews with differing abilities, the whole gamut, and even just Ashkenormativity as a, you know, sort of the founding sort of energy of and culture of the Jewish communal space. So much of what we said applies to those other conversations about diversity and inclusion and equity. And I hope people
Definitely.
also just think those ways.
Definitely. And actually those have come up in a couple of our audience Q&As. So I think we might have time for a few questions coming from our audience. So our first question comes from Brian in Los Angeles, who asks, and I think this is directed at Arya, but Rachael, because you do work with Mizrahi or Sephardic Jews in the drop-in center, this can also pertain to you as well. What does the LGBTQ plus experience look like in non-Ashkenazi Jewish communities? So Arya, you are Persian, and Rachael, you work extensively with Sephardic and Mizrahi young people. What does that experience look like for both of you?
And thank you, Brian, and also thank you for your incredible work with AJC and for bringing me onto the Access board in LA. It's been a pleasure. I caution that I do not speak on behalf of Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews, queer Jews worldwide first, because I'm giving you my unique experience as an Iranian Jew. And this, in a sense, in my culture, historically speaking, this has been such a taboo subject, so deeply oppressed and repressed, and so shame-driven and shame-inducing that people that identify as LGBTQ were always at fear, and I think to this day continue to be in fear of harming a family member's life, I mean like truly livelihood, or harming the entire reputation of their family or community as a result of us living in a collectivist society. And I say that up against an American identity, which is individualist. So in American life, in this stunning, gorgeous way, you are who you are and you stand alone, and what you do does not affect your cousin in a different state. And that's really powerful and beautiful. For me, as an Iranian Jew, what I do reflects on my brother, my sister, my cousin, my aunt, my uncle, my other family in New York, and some of them in Israel. It is a collectivist society in the sense that we are part of a system, and we always think with relation to that system, what I do either brings about honor or shame. And that is, it could be its own hour-long conversation, but that's one of the ways that it's really difficult and unique to have this conversation in particular, where we're not talking about even decades of knowledge or exposure. We're talking about really like 5 to 10 years where there have been outward role models. And before myself, thankfully, there was a small group of mostly Iranian Jewish gay men here in LA that were doing some organizing, and that were some of the first examples of us in our community. And when I think for others, when they see positive role models, individuals that are embedded in their family and community and care so deeply about Jewish values and are working to both embody their own full authentic selves, but also uplift the community to understand it and embrace it as well, there is like this sort of leaning towards us versus the backing away. And with that being said, if you can imagine that American Jewry today is ordaining trans rabbis and in the most beautiful ways, officiating queer marriages, and just the ways that the American Jewish community has come to this beautiful place around this, I think, I don't have the scientific data, but the Middle Eastern or Middle Eastern American community is very much far behind on the trajectory of education, understanding, acceptance, inclusion, and certainly, moving towards embrace. And we're doing great work, and we're working deeply and hard on that conversation to move it forward. So that's where JQ, starting our Persian Pride programming, was about having niche work that is culturally relevant. I remember actually in my own coming out process when white friends would say, it's gonna be fine, like tell your parents, rip the Band-Aid, they're gonna love you regardless. And I'm like, you have no idea what my family life is and where I'm coming from. And so I think it needs to be culturally nuanced, the organizing that happens to help people move towards greater inclusion. And that's what a lot of us are doing around the world.
Thank you. That's such an important perspective, and maybe one that's not often heard. So thank you so much for sharing. Rachael, again, I know you don't speak on behalf of all of your clients and participants who come to the center, but if you have any wisdom that might be helpful to share in your capacity as like a non-Persian who, can speak to that, that would also be helpful.
I have a few things to add. I think one, the like term that we use at JQY to refer to, I think what Arya was just talking about, is that of collective self-esteem. And collective self-esteem is this idea of there is a group of people that I identify with, and that when there is a celebration with these people, I celebrate it. And when there's something that is embarrassing or shameful, then I feel embarrassed about that. So like as a Jewish person, I felt really embarrassed when the whole Bernie Madoff thing happened. That is part of my collective self-esteem as a Jewish person. And so collective self-esteem has been proven to be one of the best ways to combat isolation and loneliness, and is one of the reasons why community building is such an important part of supporting any, I think, minority or anybody who feels like they're the only ones like them. Becoming part of a community and knowing that they're not the only ones like them is just so, it's invaluable. And that is the other thing that we talk about a lot in JQI, is this idea of minorities within minorities within minorities, right? That there are like, it's not enough to just say, okay, well, we're a Jewish organization and we're a queer organization, and now we're just like, dunsies. We like checked off those boxes and we're and now all Jewish queer people feel supported. That's certainly not true. And we need to always be proactively working to make sure that who are the people that we're missing, who are the people that whose voice, who are here, who feel like they don't feel like they're not necessarily part of this group all the way, or who still feel like they have to sort of check part of their identity at the door. And who are the people who are not here, who we need to be proactively reaching out to, and there's a reason why they're not here, and we need to be working on that. So I think, and that applies to so many different people and so many different identities. And I think the more the more identities that a person has, the more complicated it is to find other people that are like them. One thing that we started at JQI recently, and the reason we started it is because of these COVID times, where it's been really hard to facilitate like a large drop-in center support space. As you can imagine, kids have Zoom fatigue, they're tired of Zoom. It's impossible to facilitate a 30-person conversation in person, let alone on Zoom. But we started these things called close-up conversations, where it's 5 to 8 people who come, and there's like a series of 6 different, they'll come over 6 weeks, once a week, and it will be focused on a very specific thing. So most recently we have a group that is focusing on people who are come from Orthodox communities who identify as asexual. And there's been a huge amount of interest in this group, so much so that we had this group over 6 weeks, and now we're going to restart it again, so that more people can be a part of it. And just that there are so many identities that are overlooked or invisible or not seen, and this is and every single one of them has their own experience. So this is not exactly talking to the actual question, but related to that is just the numerous amounts of identities that need to be seeked out and supported proactively from us.
Absolutely. I think this is such an important point, is talking about invisible identities and talking about intersectionality. And I think that will bring us to our last audience question, and then we'll wrap up, although I'm sure we could talk for hours and hours more. This has been such an exciting and interesting conversation. So one of our audience questions asks, how can Jewish queer organizations serve an important role in helping with intersectionality issues, particularly around Israel, and speak out about the importance of Israel and its relationship to those who engage with it, especially in spaces where it may feel like that is the lightning rod issue in terms of whether one can or cannot participate in certain queer spaces. How does that work in terms of ensuring that it doesn't have to be a lightning rod issue, that it can be, Arya, you mentioned this earlier in our conversation. How is it an area where we can employ intersectionality, we can employ dialogue around this conversation? So Rachael, perhaps if you want to kick us off, or Arya, whatever is preferred.
Let me just think about it for a minute.
Sure. Sure, absolutely. Arya, do you want to start us off?
Just to say, I'm going to keep it really brief.
Sure.
We, barring my own personal connections to the state of Israel, we as an organization do not assume any relationship to the state of Israel. Although as an individual without the JQ hat, I believe so deeply and immensely in the connection between Jewish life and this, or Jewish identity, excuse me, and the state of Israel. So I think actually Rachael articulated it best in one of her other answers around there are no assumptions being made about the intersections of belief and inclusion, and that works to our benefit in the sense that we don't do direct Israel programming, but we actually do join forces with A Wider Bridge, which is an organization that does work between LGBTQ Americans and LGBTQ Israelis, and building coalitions and bridge building, and also helping non-Jewish people understand the landscape of LGBTQ life in Israel as a way by which to understand Israel. And I would be remiss not to mention just the terminology of pinkwashing, where there is a movement to suggest that Israel's only impetus to have any inclusive practices, policies, laws, or regulations is actually as a guise to hide the oppression of Palestinian civilians and Palestinian people. And I completely and utterly denounce pinkwashing, and I just want to vehemently oppose the entire ideology on the whole, given I can say in the same breath that Israel has room for growth on the subject of full LGBTQ inclusion. But all of that to say, it goes back to that piece around not making the assumption that anyone has a specific connection to Israel, but accepting and welcoming and really even trying to uplift the diversity of connections as just the richness of the fabric of community that JQ helps to create. That I think is all we can do in terms of any sphere of control we have. And even just, when we think about the nonprofit sector and the fact that Rachael and I each wear 30 hats and probably get paid half the salary of a person who'd be doing just the amount of similar work in the business world, you have to choose your priorities, and you have to think strictly about, I'm not politically engaged, publicly speaking, because my number one priority is LGBTQ inclusion. And I have a lot to say in the political space and sphere, but I measure what I give and take because I want to be able to be heard as a queer activist first. And I think that ends up coming up for us as professionals as well.
Thank you so much for that perspective, Arya. Rachael, if there's anything you wanted to add, I don't mean to put you on the spot.
No, it's all good. One thing that's coming to mind is that we had a drop-in center conversation about protests and activism, and we were talking about what are the different kinds of protests that you've been to, and what are the different kinds of conversations that you've had that felt to you like it was a form of activism. And the vast majority of people in this conversation said that their preference was not to go to protests or rallies or to be outspoken on their social media pages, but their preference was strongly for individual conversations, and that they felt that the things that made the most difference, where they felt the most heard, and where they felt that they were hearing other people and other people were hearing them, and that there was able to be progress, it was having those individual conversations. And so I think that supporting those one-on-one interactions in whatever way possible is one of the ways that I think has really intense impact. And I think that people really appreciate that more than we know.
Wonderful. This has been such a phenomenal conversation. I know we could keep going for forever and ever. But in recognition of the very brief time we have left, I just wanted to wrap up by, first of all, thanking you both for sharing these incredible perspectives. I know that as advocates in both the LGBTQ space and in many, many, many other spaces across the Jewish community, we're so grateful for your perspectives, and so delighted that you are sharing your time with us today. If there is something we didn't get to today, perhaps maybe we'll wrap up with a closing thought, and then we will unfortunately have to conclude our conversation. So closing thoughts, Rachael.
I have a million potential closing thoughts, but I think just to be really brief, I really appreciate that we're having this conversation, and to everybody who's watching, thank you, and hopefully we can together move forward in just making this world a better place, and a more inclusive and more, not even inclusive, but a place that celebrates diversity and that really values and appreciates all of the different identities that everyone brings to the table.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Rachael. Arya.
I would be remiss not to thank AJC for your own body of work, in particular in the fighting of anti-Semitism and other forms of hatred. And so again, like uplifting the gratitude for really expanding this work, as I hear in terms of an organizational commitment to deepening and expanding work in the space of fighting homophobia. Very, very grateful for that. And to everyone listening, certainly get involved with AJC Access if you're not yet, but
thank you for the endorsement.
Yeah, no, important, but also I want to name that that piece around, you don't have to be perfect at this to begin to do the work. You know the line about, we are not required to complete the work, neither can we desist from it. Please lean in with us. If you're an ally of the LGBTQ community, and if we had 50% of the allies in the world actually speaking out loud consistently, the collective of queer people and their allies would actually be the majority of human beings. And that would be incredible. And we need you, and we want you, and we thank you. So please consider just what that measurable action that you might take is to support LGBTQ life.
Amazing. That is the perfect thing to conclude with. So I really want to thank both of you, Arya and Rachael, for this fascinating and important conversation. And we look forward to continue to working with both of you as we continue in this advocacy work to ensure and safeguard the protections for LGBTQ Jews and allies around the world. I want to thank all of our audience for joining us for this session. We hope you will join us for future remote access and Advocacy Anywhere programs. If you like what you've heard today, please consider making a gift to AJC, information of which can be found on our homepage. Thank you, and be well, and hope everyone enjoys the long weekend. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Have a great one.